Welcome back, everybody. In this video, we are going to be comparing and contrasting how measures and calculate work inside of an iterator. So, which is to say, we're gonna show you using a revisor inside of an iterator. In fact, we're gonna show you using two different revisors inside of an iterator, both calculate, the calculate function, and also measures, just so we could see how they work and how they work almost in the exact same way. And then we'll show you an example of not using a revisor and why it's a completely terrible idea. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? I'm here in Filter Revisors Part 1.xlsx, and I'm on the Calc versus Measure Current Row tab, right? So this is all about current row filtering, or the lack thereof. Okay, so we've already shown you using current row filtering, using the calculate function, and using measures, and you've probably already gotten a sense that it's almost the same thing. We're just going to emphasize that here in this particular video, right? So we're going to attempt to do the same thing 3 times, right? So the very first one we're going to do is we're going to calculate average units per type using the calculate revisor. To do that, we're going to use the values derivation. So we're going to go get all the different types to go and dine in. And for each one, we're going to calculate the units for each type, right, for to go and dine in using this bit of code right here. And then we're going to average the results. And the reason for each row, for each different type, we're going to get the units for that type is because we use this calculate revisor. It's the thing that's going to filter to the current row, perform current row filtering. We will then do the exact same thing using a measure, which is in a lot of ways easier to think about, although the fact that it's easier to think about it almost makes it more difficult to understand how it's working mechanically, right? So in this one, it's the same deal. We're going to go get a table of all the different types. We're going to run the total units measure for each one. The total units measure will filter down for each row to that type, right? Perform current row filtering, right? Adding a filter for that type. Then run the sub-expression to get the total units for each one of those types and then average the results, right? Both of these will work. They will produce the exact same answer because we're asking them to do the exact same thing. The only difference is whether we use the calculate revisor, in which we have to provide the sub-expression as argument 1 of the function, as compared to using a measure, like total units right here, where when you call a measure, you don't have to specify what the sub-expression is because the sub-expression is already defined in the model. That's what a measure is. It's a sort of a calculate statement with the sub-expression predefined in the model, and you could use it over and over again by asking for it by name. So the last thing we're going to do is fail utterly by attempting to calculate average units per type. And we're likewise, we're going to go derive all the different types, right? That part will work okay. We'll get a table of to go and dine in. And we're going to add a column to it, which is good, but we're not going to have any piece of machinery that filters down to the current row. So you might think something like this works, but it will not, because for each one of these, we're going to go calculate the units, but not for each type. We're going to get the units for everything because we never ever filter down to just that particular type. Okay, so enough chit chat, now set up. Let's go do 3 of these guys, right? 3 of these guys. Okay, so first version, we're going to use the calculate revisor to do this, right? And keeping in mind, the only difference is whether we use calculate or a measure. We're going to use the same sub-expression in both of these. Okay, so speaking of which, we're going to go start by deriving all the different types. Hey, there's no filters in place, which means there's the 2 different types are to go and dine in. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to type in type. I'm going to type in type. And we're going to get to go and dine in. Those are our 2 different types, right? And then we are going to, the iterator is going to add a column to that temp table using this definition right here. This is the definition of our expression column, this whole block from line 3 through line 10. So I'm going to type in exp right here. We've already got some of this stuff pre-populated, and for both of these, we're going to do this whole big block of code, okay? So let's start here with the first one. You've seen this before. Okay, so for the first cell right there, right, that is going to run this whole big block of code from there all the way down to there. We're going to run it twice, once for each row, but we're going to start by running it for the first row, right? Do it one at a time. Okay, so what's the first thing that happens in the definition for this expression column, lines 9 through 10? Well, the very first thing that happens is a revisor, right? Is a revisor. So we're going to say we want to go do some other stuff, but before we do, we have to revise the filters. Okay, anytime you see a revisor, right, such as calculate, you want to make sure you freeze the sub-expression with your eye, with your mind's eye, right? Because when you look at the code, it won't tell you that it's frozen. It won't tell you that it's only going to run after the filters have been revised. You have to remind yourself of that, which is why I think it's a good idea to freeze that sub-expression as best you can. Make the text blue in your mind's eye if you could do that, or, give it this blue background like I'm about to do right here. I'm going to right-click. add this blue background and be like, okay, and say, the sub-expression is now frozen for a calculate. We're not going to run it until calculate's done revising the filters. Okay, so how's it going to revise the filters? Well, 2 steps, just like always. Any revisor is going to add any current row values as filters. So if there's a value for the current row or multiple values for the current row, it will add all of them as filters. And then if we provide any override filters to the revisor, it'll add those as well, right? So in terms of current row filtering, are there any values of the current row? Sure is. Type equals to go. So I'm going to come up here and do type equals to go. Okay. And the revisor, in this case calculate, will take that and add it to the filter context, to work on creating a revised filter context, right? So I'm going to hold down Control and let go to make a copy. Technically, it's going to move it, but I like to copy it. That way I could see it both there and there. Okay, good. So we've performed current row filtering, adding the value of the current filter as a row. If this bit of code over here, if after the sub-expression there was a comma and additional arguments, arguments 2, 3, 4, and 5, those would all be override filters, and we would add those. But there aren't any, right? So there are no override filters provided in this code. Therefore, after we do current row filtering, we check to see if there's any override filters, and there aren't any, so we're all done. Okay, we're done revising the filters. We've done both of these, current row filtering and override filters. Therefore, this is now our new revised filter context. Let's filter down to go. To go. Okay, and so now that we've got our revised filter context looking at just to go for this cell right here, right? Calculate says, oh good, I've done my hard work of revising the filters. Now I can unfreeze my sub-expression and run it in the new filter context. So I'm going to go ahead and unfreeze this, get the blow dryer out, heat that up, stick it in the microwave for 30 seconds. There we go. I've unfrozen my sub-expression. I can now run it because the filters are set up correctly. Got the right filter context. They've been revised. Okay, so what do? Well, we're going to go derive all the visible rows of mini. We're going to add this column to it, and we're going to sum up the results. So here's all the rows of mini. Control-C, come down here, Control-Alt-V, pay special, click on Values, click OK, right? So now I've derived all the visible rows of mini in the current filter context, which has a filter for type equal to go, introduced by the revisor through current row filtering. Now we're going to add this column to it and sum up the results. Okay, so I'm going to come over here, and I type in EXP, and when I hit enter, some wise person pre-populated this so that I wouldn't have to type it out in the video. But you can imagine for every single row, it goes and gets the units for that row, right? So it gets 2, and 1, and 3, and 2. And then it sums it up because it's a sum-x function, so 2 plus 1 plus 3 plus 2 equals 8. That 8 is the result for this particular cell in the expression column. I go ahead and type in 8, and I hit enter. But we're not done, right? As you will remember, all revisors, including Calculate, are excellent house guests, or excellent housemates, excellent roommates, and so they clean up after themselves. So once Calculate has done running this sub-expression and brought back the value 8, it's going to put back the filters to the way it found it, right? So I'm going to do Control-C up here on this little splotch of orange right there, and just Control-V paste over that to simulate putting the filters back the way that the Calculate found it. Okay. So now that we've reset the filters to the way the Calculate found it, we're actually done with this cell. Go ahead and click on here. I'm going to click no fill on that guy because we're all done with it, because now we have to move on to row number 2 and run this same bit of code here, this same definition for the expression column for this second row. Okay, so I'm going to right click, highlight it just to remind us what we're doing. We're running this code for that cell right there. Okay. Well, we're going to do the exact same thing as last time. The only difference is it's happening in a different row, right? It's happening in a row of type equals dine-in. Okay, so what happens in this the definition for this expression call? Well, very first thing is that calculate function. It calculates a revisor, which means it's going to run a sub-expression under a revised set of filters. So anytime you see a revisor, you should locate with your eyeballs where the sub-expression is and freeze it with your eyeballs. And if you happen to be in Excel, you can freeze it by doing this. I'm going to hover over it, right-click, and I'm going to give it this nice blue background. So we say, oh, brr, it's cold. This is not going to run until Calculate is done revising the filters. Okay? Just can't do it yet. Okay. So that's a sub-expression we're going to run after we revise the filters. Calculate is now going to revise the filters. 2 steps. It's going to perform current row filtering, and adding any values to the current row as filters. And then if there's any override filters, we'll add those as well. Okay, so for current row filtering, are there any values of the current row? Oh, you know what? I forgot to do it again. Sorry, let me go reset the filters here real quick. Sorry about that. when I remove the filter from up here, I should have set that back. Sorry about that if that's confusing. Okay, so for this cell right here, assuming that the filter context is empty so we can see everything, right? The very first thing it's going to do is it's going to revise the filter, right? So there's a value in the current row of type equals dine in. So let's go ahead and add that as a filter. So I'm going to do type header dine in, and then calculate. Calculate, we'll add that as a filter. So I'm going to drag that up here. I'm going to hold down Control to copy it. It's more accurate to say that it moves it, but I like to copy it. That way I can see it both there and there. Okay, good, fabulous. So now we've performed current row filtering, adding dine in as a filter. Are there any override filters? Here calculate doesn't have any additional arguments. It just has the one argument. So there are no override filters. So there's nothing we have to add. So we've done both of our steps, current row filtering and override filters. We now have a revised filter context for type equals dine in. So let's go ahead and filter down to dine in. Right, dine in, there we go. Okay, so now that we're looking at dine in, calculate, it says I'm done revising the filters. I can now unfreeze my sub-expression and run it, with being very confident in the knowledge that the filters are the way that I want them. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and unfreeze this. There we go. Okay, so now that we're done unfreezing that, we can go ahead and run this sub-expression. Well, the sumX iterator is going to take the temp table provided by this derivation, add a column to it with this definition, and sum up the results. So let's start with the derivation. Go get all the visible rows of many. Hey, there's mid right there. This isn't all the rows, it's all the visible rows. The ones that are visible given a filter of type equals dine in. So I click down here, Control Alt V to paste special, and I do values. And I hit OK, there we go. So now I've derived all of the visible rows of the mini table in the with the filter context of type equals dine in. I can now add a column to it with this definition and sum up the results. So I come over here, I type in EXP, I hit enter, and somebody's already done all the hard work. So for each row, we get the units, and we sum it up. So for that row, we get 1. For that row, we get 1. And for that row, we get 2. We sum the whole thing up because it's the sumX function, and we get 4. So I'm going to go ahead and come over here and type in 4. 4 is the value that the calculate function returns, right? It is the answer that calculate's going to go ahead and bring back. But calculate's not done, right? Calculate still has to tidy up, right? It's a good roommate. So now the calculate has brought back the number before it leaves exit stage left, right? It's going to go ahead and set the filters back the way it found it. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to click on that right there, Control C to copy, come over here, select that, and Control V to paste to set those filters back. And this time I'm actually going to remember to undo that filter right there. There we go. Okay, good. Good. So now we are all done with that cell right there. Go ahead and do no fill right there. Okay. Which means we're done adding this expression column, right? We did it for each and every row. We did it for that row and for that row. So this is all done. Go ahead and set this back to the way it was. Maybe, eventually, possibly. Okay, there we go. So we derived this table. We added this column to it. What are we going to do with the results? We're going to average them because it's the average x function. So what is the average of that? Well, let's find out. The average of 8 and 4. I bet I could probably do this one in my head. I bet you could too. But I'm going to go ahead and use the average function. And when I do, I get 6, which is the answer we were looking for. Okay, now let's go do the exact same thing using a measure. The exact same thing. Exact same thing, right? So similarly, in this particular example, we're going to go get a table of all the different types. For every single type, we're going to revise the filters down to just that type. That's what the measure is going to do. And then the measure, after it revises down to just that particular type, whether it's to go or dine in, it will run this sub-expression calculating the total units for each one of those rows, right? So we'll get one there, and we'll get one there, and when we're all done, average x will go ahead and average that row, giving us the exact same answer because we're asking it to do the exact same thing. The only difference now is that the sub-expression we want to run under revised filters isn't provided inside of a calculate function. It's provided by the measure itself because it's defined in the measure. Okay, let's get to it. So just like before, we've got our filters nice and clear. Fantastic. I got this set up. Actually got that right this time. So let's go get all the types, right? So our first bit is to go do that derivation right there. We get all the types. Type equals to go and dine in. Type to go dine in, right? And we're going to add an expression column to it with this definition, right? That definition right there. So for each and every row, we're going to go run the total units measure. We're going to do it for that row, and we're going to do it for that row. Okay, cool. So let's think about let's think about this cell right here. Let's just focus on it for a minute, okay? So that is going to run that block of code right there. And by block, I mean single snippet of code, very tiny. But I'll highlight it anyways, because why not? Be consistent. Okay. So for that cell, it's going to run the total units measure. Well, what is the total units measure going to do? Well, it's going to do two things, because measures are revisors, right? So it's going to revise the filters and then run the sub-expression. And when you see a revisor, such as total units, that's being called, that's being used, you want to make sure that you freeze that sub-expression with your eyes and make sure you understand that this will only run after the filters have been revised. So to help us do that, I'm going to go ahead and give it this nice blue background color. Pretend that it's frozen, right? Pretend that it's frozen. Okay, good. So now that this is frozen, the total units measure can go ahead and add a filter for the current row, right? Well, actually, it's going to perform, it's going to revise the filters, so it's going to perform both current row filtering, and if there were override filters, it would add those too. So let's start with current row filtering. Are there any values of the current row? Yeah, sure there is. Type equals to go. Good. Okay. So I'm going to come over here and type in type equals to go, right? And so the measure is going to take that value of type equals to go and add it as a filter, right? So the reason this works, the reason we get a number that's going to make sense is because of this step right here, where the measure filters down to just the current row by adding a value, a filter value for the current row. Hold down Control and let go to copy it. More realistic to say that I move it, but I like to copy it. That way I can see it both here and here. Okay, good. So now that we've got this filter in place, we've performed current row filtering. Now I'm going to ask, are there any override filters? Well, if there were, on the end of the total units measure here, there would be a little opening parentheses and a bunch of other stuff, and then a closing parentheses. That would be an additional override filter that somebody could provide. But I don't see it, and you shouldn't see it either. That's because there are no override filters in this instance. So we don't have to worry about them. Okay, we've performed current row filtering. There are no override filters, so we don't have to add them. That means we are done revising the filters. We've created a revised filter context that looks like this. Speaking of which, let's go down and look at to go. This should feel very familiar to the thing we just did because it's the exact same thing. Okay, so we filter down to go, right? So now that we're just looking at to-go transactions, right, the measure says, oh, good, I have filtered down to just to go. Now I can unfreeze my sub-expression, run it. Speaking of which, let me unfreeze this sub-expression. I'm only allowed to do this after I've revised the filters. So I unfreeze it, and now I go ahead and run it, right? Go get all the visible rows of many with that derivation right there. Pass into the SUMX iterator, which will add a column with the definition, go get the units for each row, and then it will sum up the results. Easy peasy. So let's go scoop this up. Control-C to copy. Come down here, Control-Alt-V to paste special. And boy, my keyboard's not liking me today. Control-Z to undo that. Control-Alt-V to paste special. There we go. Much better. I click on values and I hit OK. Good. So now I've derived that temp table with all the visible rows in the mini table. Not all of them, just the to-go rows, because that's all that's visible under the current filter context. I come over here, I type in EXP, right, to add an expression column. The definition of the expression column is right there. So for every single cell, we should get the units for that row. So we should get 2, 1, 3, and 2. Want to go ahead and hit enter? Sure enough, 2, 1, 3, and 2. And what do we do with the results? We sum them up because this is the SUMX function. The sum of all those guys right there is the number 8. So the number 8 is what gets returned by the total units measure to this cell right here. So that's actually 8 right there, okay? But we're not done. We're not completely done with this cell, right? Because revisors are good roommates. They're going to clean up after themselves, right? So the total units measure is going to set the filters back to the way it was when it found them. So it revised it to go run the sub-expression. Now it has to put it back. So to do that, I'm going to click right here. Control-C to copy. Hover over there. Control-V to paste. There we go. We've set the filters back. I'm even going to remember to do this time. 50-50 each time as to whether or not I actually remember that step. There we go. So now I'm actually all done with that cell. So I'm going to right-click on it and unhighlight it because we are done with that cell. And now we can highlight the cell directly underneath it because we have to go run that same process for the second row, the dine-in row. I right-click, I come down here, and I choose that yellow color. There we go. So we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it for that row right there, right? So what are the actual instructions here for our expression column? We'll go run the total units measure. Well, if it's a measure, it's definitely a revisor, which means it has a sub-expression. So we're going to remind ourselves that that sub-expression is only going to run after the filters have been revised. So I'm going to go ahead and freeze it to remind myself of just that idea. This is, it's frozen. Like it's sealed up, right? We're only going to run it after we revise the filters. Okay, so total units wants to run this, but it has to revise the filters first. How do we revise the filters? 2 steps. current row filtering, and override filters. So for current row filtering, are there any values of the current row? Yeah, sure, type equals dynin. So the measure will add a filter for type equals dynin. Right, so that's what the filter looks like, and now I'm going to go ahead and grab that, move it up here, hold down Control to make a copy of it. More accurate to say that it moves it, but I'm just going to copy it. I like to see it both there and there. Good, okay, so now we've performed current row filtering, adding any values of the current row as filters. By the way, if the current row had like 4 or 5 different items in it, it would add all 4 or 5 up here. But right now it's just got the one, type equals dynin, so it just adds that. We're done with current row filtering. Now, if there were any override filters, we would add those. We would know that there are override filters here for the measure because there would be little opening parentheses after this and instructions for what the filter should look like. But we don't see those, so there are no override filters, so we could safely ignore them, right? Good, okay. So we've performed current row filtering. There are no override filters to add, so we are done revising the filters. And by we, I mean total units, the total units measure. It is done revising the filter. So we now have a revised filter context for type equals dynin. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this and go look on type equals dynin. There we go. So now that we've got that, we've got our filters revised just the way we want them. The measure says, good. I've been eyeballing this sub-expression for a while now. My plans can finally manifest themselves. I can go ahead and unfreeze this and run it in the new revised filter context. Because the filters are just the way that I want them. Okay, so what do we do? Well, the sumX iterator says we're going to go derive a temp table with all the visible rows of mini. We're going to add a column to it with the definition of get the units for each row, and then we will sum up the results of this new column. Cool. Go ahead and select this right here, Control-C to copy it. Come on down here, Control-Alt-V to paste special. Hey, I got it this time. I click on values and I click OK. There we go. I've derived all of the rows related to dynin as opposed to before where it was all the rows related to go. Now it's just dynin because we have a filter for it. Now I have to add an expression column to it, right? So the expression column should have the units for each and every row. So it should say 1, 1, and 2. So I come over here, EXP. I hit enter. I get 1, 1, and 2, and I sum those results up because it's the sumX function. If it were the average X function, it would average them, right? So 1 plus 1 plus 2 equals 4. And this is what gets returned by the total units measure to this cell right here. Is the number 4. And we're almost done, right? But before we can call it a day, right, the total units measure says, oh gosh, I made a mess in the filter context. I have to clean it up and get it back to the way that I found it, right? So we're going to undo that change to the filter context that the measure made, right, by adding the filter for type equals dynin. So I'm going to do Control-C. I'm going to go ahead and erase that. Good. Now it's back to the way it was. The total units measure is all done with things, right? I can go ahead and set this filter back. Okay, good. Now we're looking at everything. I'm done with this cell right there. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the highlighting, maybe. There we go. Okay. And I can even remove the highlighting there because we're done adding that expression column to the outer table. How about that? How about that? Oops. Should be that one right there. Okay, good. So for our code here, right, we've derived all the different types. So there they are. That's a temp table right there. We've added a column to it with the definition. Go get the total units for each one, right? There we go. 8 and 4 for 8 for to go and 4 for dynin. And now we're going to average the results because it's the average X function. So I come over here. I type in equals average. Double click on it. I bet you could do this one in your head, especially since we got the same numbers last time because we asked you to do the same thing last time. Okay. So I take the average of those two, and what do I get? I get 6. I get 6 right there, right? So we could see that, the only difference between this example and the one above, right? Like all this stuff over here is exactly the same. The only difference is here the sub-expression is defined explicitly in the code, and because of that we have to use the calculate function, which allows us to specifically type in what we want the sub-expression to be that we run into revised filters. Down here we actually refer to the measure, and that means that the sub-expression is defined in the model. It's part of the metadata of the model, right? So a while ago, somebody built a measure called totalunits and predefined the sub-expression. That way in our code up here, we don't have to type all that stuff out. We just type in total units. This one's a little bit easier to look at, but honestly, this one's actually a little bit easier to understand mechanically. Because this one just says total units right there, it could actually be a little tricky to remember that this is indeed a revisor and that the measure itself is the thing that filters down to go and filters down to dynin. Most folks will remember or will assume or guess that something is filtering down to go and something is filtering down to dynin. most people will not remember that it's the measure that does it, right? But you guys are not those folks, because now you understand that it's the measure that filters down to the current row. Okay, so I would like to point out that the two examples that I've just shown are examples of the per item pattern, right? We're not focusing too much on the patterns just yet, but we're running into them, you know, now and again, right? And so these are examples of the per item pattern. And the per item pattern is pretty simple, right? So the per item pattern is just any time that you've got an iterator where the first argument is a derivation and the definition of your expression column includes a revisor, because you're always doing the same thing. The derivation gets a table of things, like it could be different shifts or different types or different dishes, right? For each shift or type or dish, the revisor filters down to just that shift or type or dish, performs some calculation, right? And so maybe you get the total units for each shift, or maybe you get the total sales for each type, or maybe you get the total cost for each dish. And then when you're done with that, you use the iterator to perform an aggregation on it, right? So, what we're doing is we're getting a list of items, and we're performing a calculation once per item, and then we aggregate the result. Hence the name, the per item pattern, right? So it's true here where we're using a measure, right? The measure is the revisor. And it's also true right here where the revisor is the calculate function. And because they have the same sub-expression and nothing else, these would give us the exact same results, right? Okay, so let's go see an example of this thing failing spectacularly when we forget to use the revisor, which you will do at least once in your career, right? And we could almost barely fit this thing on here, right? Okay, so this is sort of kind of a newbie mistake, right? You will see this out in the wild a lot. Hey, I want to go calculate the average units for my different shift types. Oh, okay. I'll just write this. Should I go get all my types, right? And then for each one, I calculate the units and I average the results. Should work, right? Well, I don't know. Let's walk through it. I hope by now you can look at this and at least get a sense, no, this should not work, if only because I keep telling you that it won't work. But let's watch it not work, okay? So what do? We're going to go perform this derivation right there. Go get all the different types. There's no filters in place when we start out, pretty much like always. So we get to go and dine in. That's going to be our derivation right there. So we get type, to go and dine in, right? And now, just like before, we're going to add an expression column with this definition right there. So I'm going to type in exp, right? And now notice this time, in our expression column definition, there is no revisor. Nowhere is a revisor, which means, right, hint, 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 there's no piece of machinery that's going to filter down to go, and there's no piece of machinery that's going to filter down to dine in. So let's see what happens when we run this, okay? So let's look at that cell right there. Let's go ahead and highlight it, okay? So for that cell right there, nothing changes the filters. The filters stay exactly as they are. They were blank a minute ago, and they're blank now because there's no revisor to go change them. If you wanted to change the filter, you should have called a revisor, okay? So with the same filters we had in place, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to go get all the visible rows of mini. We're going to add this column to it. We're going to sum up the results. And I can already tell this is wrong, right? Because I would expect that this is looking for to-go stuff, but that's not what I'm going to get. What I'm going to get is everything, because there's no filter for to-go, because I never told to add a filter for to-go. So I Control-C to copy that, Control-Alt-V to paste special, paste values, right? And now I get all the rows, not just the to-go rows, all of them, because I never filtered down to to-go because I never used a revisor, right? Okay, so what do I do now? I go add an expression column with all the units, gets all the units, and then I sum it up. So for every single row, I'll get the units for that row and sum up the results. Yeah, you guys get it. Okay. Brian, we've heard this 10 billion times from you. We get it. Okay. So I type in exp. I get 2 and 1 and 1 and 3 and 2 and 1 and 2. So that's my expression column. It gets the units for each row, and then it sums it up. And so I'm going to type in sum right here. I don't know why that's not pre-populated. I go ahead and enter, and I get 12, right? And so my answer right there is 12. Keep in mind, right, 12 is not the number of to-go units. 12 is the number of all units, right? So this is the units for everything, not just to-go. So you can already see that this is not working. Okay, do we have to set the filters back? We never changed the filters. There's nothing to set back. Okay, so we're done with that cell right there. Done with that cell right there. And you probably should have a guess at this point what the next cell is going to be. But let's find out. Let's find out. Okay, so for that cell right there, right, it's going to run that same definition, the same definition of the expression column, which does not include a revisor, which means there's no piece of machinery to filter down to the current row of dine in, right? So what do? We go get all the visible rows of many. Oh, well, there they are. Hey, wait, shouldn't we be looking at the dine in ones? Well, maybe, but the code didn't ask us to. So we're going to go ahead and get everything. Control-C, come down here, Control-Alt-V to paste special, Control-Z, Control-Alt-V to paste special. Not sure why my keyboard is so upset with me today. Maybe the batteries are running low. There we go. Okay. Hey, this and this look a lot alike. Yeah, they sure do. The filters are exactly the same each time, which is why that derivation right there produces the same table each time. Okay. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to go get, we're going to add an expression column that gets the units for every single row and then sum up the results. And this should look remarkably like it did a second ago because it's the exact same instructions. Okay, so just like before, we've got all the rows, both to go and dine in, both there and there. So we get the units for each one, and we sum those up. There we go. I get 12. This is 12, right? And so now there's no filters to set back because we never changed them in the first place because we didn't use a revisor like we should have, like I told you to. So now I'm going to go ahead and unhighlight that one. Right there. Okay. So now we've got the expression column set up for our table right here where we've got 12 and 12, right? Now, the intuition should be that the 12 is the number of to-go units and 12 is the number of dine units, but that's not correct. 12 is the total number of units altogether. So if you take the average of these guys, what's the average of 12 and 12? Well, again, you don't have to be particularly good at math to know that the average of 12 and 12 is probably, almost certainly, 12, which is not the average units per type, which should be, of course, 6. So because in the definition of our expression column, we did not use a revisor, we did not filter down to just to go. We did not filter down to just dine in, which is why this little bit of code right here, which would otherwise be a sub-expression, did not give us the results that we wanted to, because the derivation is not sort of restricted down just to a particular type. It went ahead and got everything, right? So if you're going to do this kind of per item calculation, be sure you use a revisor. Brian, should I use a measure or should I use calculate? It doesn't particularly matter. There's different reasons why you might want to use one or the other. They both more or less do the same thing. Just make sure that you use at least one of them. Okay. I think you've got this current row filtering thing down, at least good enough for now. So with all that, I sure hope you enjoyed that video, and I will see you in the next video.